So, you'll remember that we're doing a series which is about the Tantric Guru. It's about the Tantric Guru and reality. So I think in Tibetan tradition, there's this idea, and in Indian tradition, there's this idea that you might have this amazing guru who's completely crazy, bonkers, but knows exactly what you need and makes you do weird things. So, ignores you and then is really friendly to you, sends you up mountains for 6 years, that longer, that kind of stuff. And through that, you come face to face with reality. Now, that's not exactly the way, as you've noticed, we don't really do that here. But and for very good reasons, actually, because I think being able to handle a guru is difficult for some of us because it's just not part of our culture. And there has been all sorts of things that have gone terribly wrong, as you'll know, when people have kind of given themselves over to a guru who's actually not been the real thing. So we don't do guru, but actually, in a way, you don't need it, because life will just be the guru for you. Life is difficult enough, it throws up reality in lots of different ways. So that's what we're looking at in this series. I think we've looked at the guru of people that you find difficult last week. And this week I'm looking at the guru of suffering. In particular, the intense suffering that comes from grief, but wider suffering generally. And that's often where we really have to come up to face with reality. Because when we suffer, it's painful and we don't like it. So as we do that, as we look at grief and suffering, we're going to do it as a quick tour of the 6 realms of the Wheel of Life, which is what's up here, and look at the 4 Noble Truths as well. And I'm going to start by telling a story that you probably know, which is the story of Kisagotami. So Kisagotami lived 2,500 years ago at the time of the Buddha. And we're going to go to Shravasti on the pilgrimage, which is where this all takes place. And actually, even now, it's quite a pleasant place, actually. So Kisagotami. So Kisa literally means thin, emaciated, haggard, skinny. And maybe skinny is seen as good in our culture now. I don't think it was at that time. Skinny was not good when people didn't have enough to eat. So she was, so she was a bit of being called Kisa, being called skinny, was not, it was a bit of an insult, really. So she was someone who came from a poor background, and she married, and I imagine she married pretty young, as was the tradition, and she married into a much richer family. And in that family, she moved into that family, which is still the tradition in India today, that the woman will move completely into the family of the man she marries. And I think they weren't particularly nice to her, and I think sadly that's still the tradition in some ways, that she was treated quite badly when she first moved there. And it was kind of part of what she was there for was to produce an heir, a son. Years and years went by and that wasn't happening. But at last, she got pregnant and gave birth to a lovely little boy, a little son, the heir. And having been actually one of the lowest in the household, she then started to get a bit of an identity of being quite an important person, because she was the mother of this little boy who was going to carry on the family. After a little while, her husband died, and I think she was then very much sort of on her own, but she had her son, and in a way, having that son protected her, I suppose. So things were going really well. He was growing up into a lovely little boy, playing around, until one day, sadly, he became very ill and he died. And she was completely, as you can imagine, she was completely grief-stricken by this happening to her. And she lost touch with reality. She just reacted really badly. She really didn't want her son to be dead. So she picked him up in a bundle and she went round everybody in the city asking, please can you help me? Please can somebody give me some medicine for my little boy? There must be something that somebody can do that will make him better. She was denying the fact that he died. And as she went round, at first people were sympathetic, but I think some people began to get a little bit impatient with her actually, and find it very difficult that she was walking around holding this bundle, and were quite horrible to her. But at last, somebody said to her, well, why don't you go and see the Buddha? He's he's an enlightened teacher who is teaching at the edge of the city. If you go and visit him, maybe he'll be able to help you. So I think she was just really relieved to actually have some hope. So she went carrying her bundle still. She went to the edge of the city, to the green place, the gardens where the Buddha was teaching. And I'm imagining that he was there talking to a whole group of people. He was actually in the process of teaching. And I think she probably, I mean, who knows, it doesn't say this in the story actually, but she just barged straight in and said, "Please, can you help me? I've heard that you might be able to help save the life of my child." So I can imagine that everybody went really quiet and they were looking and they were thinking, "Oh, I wonder how the Buddha's going to answer this one." And I think they were a bit surprised by what the Buddha did next, because what he did was he said, "Okay, I'm going to see what I can do. What you need to do is you need to go and get me a mustard seed." And Kisagotami thought, great, mustard seed is used really commonly in every household. I'll be able to get some from somewhere. And the Buddha said, well, just one thing, could you get it from a household where there's nobody has died? So she thought, okay, well, I won't be able to get it from my house because my husband has died, but maybe, I'm sure I'll find somewhere where I can get this mustard seed. So she set off with a lot of hope. So walking back into Shravasti, she called at the first village, the first house, and knocked on the door, and an old lady answered, and Kisagotami said, "Do you have some mustard seed?" And the old lady said, yes, of course I have, yeah, come and get some. And then as they went into the house, Kisagotami said, "And has anyone died in this household?" And the old lady said, well, her whole mood changed, and she said, well, yes, my own husband has died, my parents died, this house has been in our family for generations, many people have died here. So Kisagotami thought, okay, that's no good, I'll try the next one. So she went to the next one. A much younger woman answered, "Could I have some mustard seed?" Yes, of course. Has anybody died here? "Oh, well, I'm afraid they have. I myself have had 2 stillborn children. My cousin died recently." Just like, somebody had died in that household too. So she went from household to household, and in every household there'd been someone who'd died. And as the day went on, she began to realise that this was happening everywhere. That however many houses she went on, knocked on the door of, they'd always have someone had died in that household. And because of actually experiencing for herself that this is happening in every household, she began to realise impermanence, and she began to come back to her senses, and she realised that her own son had died. So she stopped herself, stopped going from house to house, and took the body of her son to the cremation ground of the town, and was able to put her burden down, put the bundle down, and give the little son a burial, and let go of him. And in fact, start grieving in a way. It's not that was the end of her grief, but she was able to actually start the whole process of letting go of him and to start grieving. So after she'd done that, she went back to the Buddha, and she approached the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Have you got the mustard seed?" And she said, "No. I don't have the mustard seed, but I have put my burden down." And he talked briefly to her about impermanence, I think probably in the kindest way. And through hearing that, through the kind of directness and rawness of her own grief, she really saw through, she really understood impermanence in her gut. And from that, she let go of all those kind of false views that she was holding about where happiness would come from, and she became a stream entrant. When someone becomes a stream entrant, what that means is that the whole process of moving towards enlightenment is irreversible. She has seen through the fact that happiness is not going to come, that things are not permanent, and because of that, she is in the stream that is moving her towards enlightenment. And after that, she joined the Buddha's community, and she went into the forest. And it's described that she became a nun, but I think nun's the wrong word, because for me, the image of a nun is somebody very kind of calm, and it's there in a monastery or a nunnery, and it's all very beautiful, a convent, and there's loads of them, and they're kind of walking about very calmly. But actually, she was living out in the forest, in rags, begging for her food on her own. So it was quite a full-on and very scary lifestyle that she was leading. And after some time, she did become enlightened herself. So this story is quite interesting, actually, because it comes from The Stories of the Nuns, it's called, which is the written, the stories come from 2,500 years ago. They're the stories of the women disciples of the Buddha who became enlightened. And they would have been told in the oral tradition and passed down from person to person. And then at some point written on palm leaves. And then those palm leaves would have been, they'd destroyed, so people would have written them out again. And those stories have come all the way down to us 2,500 years later. And it's the first collection of writing, religious writing by women that's known of. So it's quite an important kind of historical document. So, the story. Okay, so the first thing is that I really like the Buddha's kindness and skillfulness in the way that he met her. So, he didn't say, "Come on, Kisagotami, what are you doing? There's impermanence, don't you know about that?" And what he did was he allowed her to find out for herself through her own experience. And I think that is really the way that we can learn the Dharma, is through our own experience and through reflecting on our own experience. Nobody can do it for us. We have to do it ourselves. And I think the skillfulness and the kindness of the Buddha in helping somebody to do that for herself really comes across to me. Okay, so what did Kisagotami realise when she became a stream entrant? So this is what she said. "To the world, the sage," that's the Buddha, "has praised the value of noble friendship. By resorting to noble friends, even a fool becomes wise. One should resort to worthy people, for thus one's wisdom ever grows. By resorting to worthy people, one is freed from suffering. One should know the four noble truths, suffering and its origination, then the cessation of suffering and the noble eightfold path." So, keeping company with wise people is a good idea. So it's very good to come to the Buddhist Centre. And, we talk a lot about spiritual friendship at other times. But what I'm going to explore today, really, I suppose, is the Tantric Guru, as it were, of the Four Noble Truths. And the teaching of the Four Noble Truths is the first teaching the Buddha gave when he was at Sarnath. And again, we're going to go there, so which is quite extraordinary. And it's the first teaching he gave after his enlightenment. But I've puzzled over it a lot, because it kind of seems a bit too almost glib. Anyway, let's just explore what that is. You might well be remembering this from your intermediate newcomers course. Okay, I don't know if you can read that, but anyway, the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, there is an end of suffering, there is a path that leads from suffering. So this was actually a formula that doctors used at the time of the Buddha. It's very pragmatic, okay? So it's not the theory, really. It's what you actually do. Start where you are. So you could apply it to toothache, okay? So if you've got toothache, there's suffering. You've got toothache. There's a cause of suffering. So you've got a big hole in your tooth and the kind of nerves getting infected or whatever happens, and that's making you suffer. There's an end of suffering. So if you get it all cleaned up and get the infection cured, hopefully you won't have to have the tooth taken out, and you'll just there'll be an end in your suffering. And there's a path that leads from suffering. So I suppose that would be clean your teeth, don't eat too much sugar, that kind of stuff. Okay. So you can see how you can apply it to very mundane things. You don't feel like you're getting high enough grades for something you're studying. So there's your suffering, because you're feeling like you're not getting high enough grades. There's a cause of it. Well, if you look at it, it's actually because you're not really revising very much. So there's an end to that, would be you do revise and you get the grades you want. The path would be, well, you set out your revision timetable and you plan it and you repeat it and all that kind of stuff. So you can see how very mundane it is, okay? And so it's interesting that what the Buddha did was... this is what he really concentrated on in his first talk. And that's because the Buddha was very pragmatic. What he was worried about is the fact that we all suffer, that human beings suffer. That we have to face old age, illness, we have to face death. And he wanted to look at a way that we could find freedom from that suffering. And it starts with this, Buddhism starts with this very practical, emotional thing, hopefully that will get us engaged. So it's not just some kind of abstruse philosophy, it's something that will make us want to act. And suffering, extreme suffering, certainly makes me want to act. I really want to get away from it when I'm experiencing it. There's a phrase that a person practicing the Dharma should be like someone whose turban is on fire. Okay? You would act quickly if your turban was on fire. And I think really coming up and facing our suffering, the Tantric Guru of our suffering, can really make us take action. It is important to say that, Buddhism is not all about suffering. And I think perhaps in the 19th century it was presented as that. But it really, it isn't. It's just saying that suffering is part of our experience. There's also an awful lot of joy in our experience. And in fact, what Buddhism is trying to do for us is to help us move away from suffering, to find different ways to engage with suffering. So let's look at each one. So the first one, there is suffering. Now actually, when I very first heard this on my first introductory course, whenever it was, I found it a real relief, bizarrely enough, because I could stop trying so hard all the time. Because I think I had a bit of an idea, and I still have really, if only I organised everything completely properly, then I'd be happy. So that if I was managed to get the right job, the right partner, the right house, the right holidays, all that kind of stuff, then I would be happy. And in a way, I think that is a bit of a kind of myth that we might have in our culture, that if only we get the right products and act in the right way, we know we can be happy all the time. So to think that actually suffering is just part of the human experience, and you're not kind of a failure when you experience suffering. It's not because you can't handle things or something. It's just, there is suffering. It will happen. Being a human being means that we suffer. I found that a real relief. And I think something that's very interesting around suffering and how we deal with it is the idea of the second arrow or the dart. So this is a story that the Buddha told. And the idea is that there's somebody who's just been hit in the head with an arrow, kind of lying on the floor, and someone's going up and kind of going, oh, let's get the arrow out and let's get you fixed up. And he's going, but no, I need to know where this arrow came from, who made it, what kind of feathers did they put in it, what kind of wood is it, what kind of bow did they use to make it, and asking all these kind of questions. And that's what happens in the story. I suppose I think like a kind of, the way that I'd react to that is you kind of go, oh my God, I've been hit in the head with an arrow, how stupid am I shouldn't have been going there that day, that's going to ruin my whole life. Those are the kind of the thoughts that come up. So it's a bit like, not only have we got the arrow in our head, which is a bit bad really, but we've also making it much worse for ourselves with all these stories. And that is really the secondary type of suffering that we live. So you can't help getting ill, you can't help having accidents, they are just going to happen to you. We have impermanent bodies. People we know will die, they have impermanent bodies. Things will happen that we don't like, that suffering will happen. But what we can do is we can look at the secondary stuff we put on it, all that stuff we put on it, it's my fault, it's their fault, I'm bad, they're bad. This is it, my life is ruined, all that kind of stuff. We can look at that, and that can really help us suffer much less, actually, if we look at. And actually, there can often be, secondary, third, fourth kind of arrows. And a really good one is where you go, I'm a Buddhist, and I really ought to be thinking this, okay? And that's another way to give yourself a whole load of distress, where you kind of go, I'm a really bad Buddhist, because, anyway, so, we're doing what you can to be, actually just experience your suffering as it is, without the stories, actually can really help the suffering not be quite so awful as your mind might be telling you it is. Okay, so there are two ways we can react to suffering. So we can either try to distract ourselves from it, which we do all the time, I do all the time, or we can really indulge in it and identify with it and make it part of our identity, actually. Become like a kind of, I am this person who this dreadful thing happened to. But actually, I think what we're trying to do is find a middle way between the two. So we're being aware and mindful of our experience. We're not pushing it away. We're not getting caught up in stories of, I'm such a victim. I mean, I'm exaggerating there a bit because obviously if bad things happen to us, it's not surprising that we find it difficult. But I think there's a way that maybe sometimes, many years after something's happened, you still identify as that person. Yeah. I always used to have this self-identity of being really shy and not getting on with people. And it had to quite a lot of things had happened to me where people were telling me this isn't true before I could let go of that identity, because it was so much part of my identity that I was really shy. And if I was ever in a situation with somebody else, it was their job to talk to me and to make conversation. And it was like, it really wasn't until I was actually on my ordination retreat and I got it reflected to me back quite strongly that if that had ever been true, it was no longer true, that I was able to go, oh yes, I have, that is not me. That's an identity I've been holding on to. Shy person, doesn't like standing in front of a lot of people, that kind of a person. It was about, letting go of that was actually really helpful. Okay. And interestingly, actually, we can be with the suffering we're experiencing, and without getting caught up in the stories, without pushing it away. It's not necessarily morbid, and it doesn't necessarily lead to depression and despair. In fact, there's something about if we can be with the suffering, if we can really know impermanence, we can really enjoy the joy of simple things in life. And you probably know this from experience you may well have had when someone has, you've been bereaved, someone's been ill. Yesterday I helped my mum move house, and I don't think she's ever really liked the house she's been living in and moved from, and nor have I particularly, but it was interesting how much I enjoyed that house yesterday when it was the last day I was ever going to see it, actually. Just that that's quite interesting how that happens. That if we're really aware of impermanence, we will actually enjoy our experiences and be much more present in our experience. Okay, so we're still here on this is suffering, there is suffering, and what I'm going to do is go over here and look at the wheel of life. We're going to use the wheel of life as a way to explore different types of suffering. And you probably remember the Wheel of Life from your introductory course. I think it's in about the second week or even the first week that we get it out. And it's a wonderful teaching aid, from a very ancient teaching aid. And there's lots of different parts to it. But I'm concentrating on this here, which is the realms. Just make Tanzil work really hard. Okay. So this is a simplistic version of those realms. So what these are different states. So traditionally, they're different states that a being might be born into, but they're actually can also be seen as states of being, psychological states. We can go through all these different states in an hour sometimes, certainly in a few days. They're places where we live in a way, where we're in certain mental states, a kind of reality we create for ourselves. So the top one is the God realm, okay? And that's just really blissful. And people there, beings who live there, the gods live there, and I kind of think it's a bit like, they just kind of hang out, and everything's really beautiful, and they eat really lovely. If they want to eat something, some food will just appear, whatever they need is just there for them. They have a really lovely time. The only thing about them is they become very complacent, and they also become, they don't have compassion for other beings that are suffering, because they're having such a good time that they just can't even, I don't think they can even imagine. Well, that's how I feel sometimes. Sometimes when my life has gone really well, and all those things I think I need to make me happy are happening, then I find myself, oh, my own alarm's going. I find myself, it's actually really hard not to understand what it feels like to suffer. It's a bit of a shame. It's like a lack of imagination I have, is that I can't, really relate to it. So the beings that are in that state, and that's a state that, you might know when you're on holiday, listening to music, that kind of a state. Okay. Then there's another state which is, I've called competition, because they're called like anti-gods or demigods, and basically they really hate these gods, and they're at war all the time. And it's interesting because it's a particular way of being which is very, the two genders are very different. So I think this is quite an androgynous kind of place. But in this one, men are men and women are women. Yes. So And it's a kind of, I kind of imagine it's the kind of place where, like, if you were like a really successful footballer, you'd be living a lot of your time there. Because, you know, if you break your leg, you're going to be out. If you don't play very well, you're out. But you want to be here where the really, you know, I don't know, where David Beckham lives or somewhere. So I feel like I'm a bit out of my depth, actually. But you may know this, you know, many workplaces are full of are very competitive, trying to do other people down. Some marriages are, some friendships are, some families are like that. It's a sort of like watch your back kind of place to live, okay? So we know that. So there's a lot of suffering in there. There's a lot of suffering. But in a way, the way that they suffer, because they so want to be like this, is they suffer so they become very aggressive, and they're moving away from bliss. Do you see what I mean? How they're behaving, because they so want this bliss and they're being very aggressive to get it, is actually creating a world in which they're not experiencing bliss. So there's a lot of suffering there. Then there's another realm, which we call the hungry ghosts. That's where they live. And the hungry ghosts, if you haven't come across them, they're these figures that have huge stomachs, tiny little necks, and like a pinprick for a mouth, and big eyes. And they just want all the time. So this is the realm of consumerism, of addiction, of just wanting. And when they do get something to eat, they're really hungry, but it just turns to poison. So they're very unhappy. And I think when you see images of this realm, it's kind of, you know, completely destroyed. It's horrible. It's like a kind of ecological cataclysm kind of thing. And I think it's kind of interesting in terms of very much about our culture now sometimes. Okay, and obviously they're really suffering because they're really craving for something and they're not getting what they need. Okay, they keep wanting, and they're not getting it. Then we go down to hell. Oh, okay, so coming back, so to competition. In competition, Kisagotami, when she was living in the household with her mother-in-law and her husband and stuff like that, she was living in that realm. Because it's a bit like it was a really horrible household, it sounds like. They were really horrible to her. And it was kind of through the status of her son that she had a place in that. So that was the suffering she experienced then. I think she was in the hungry ghosts when her son died, and she was looking for something that would bring him back, and it just wasn't possible. And I think she was also in hell, actually. So hell, in Buddhism, there's cold hells and there's warm, hot hells, okay? And hell is all that awful suffering that is going on in the world, suffering of war, starvation, poverty. It's also the suffering of depression, anxiety. When you're really in the grip of depression or anxiety, you are basically living in hell. So there's a lot of suffering there. And of course, in her deep grief, she was living, that's where she was living. Okay, then there's the realm of animals, and that's kind of like, so animals are basically going about looking for someone to mate with, something to eat, somewhere to have shelter. That's what they're concerned with. And then we have the human realm. And the great thing about the human realm is it's got both smiley and not smiley in, because we're happy enough sometimes that we're well enough, because you know, in order to make progress, you need to have a certain amount of happiness in your life. But also we do experience suffering, which gives us that nudge to move on. We see that actually the wheel of life doesn't work for us, and we need to do what we can to work off it. And you can't see this probably, but it says think. And the great thing that humans can do is we can think, okay? And we can look around and we can learn, and we can understand ourselves, and we can make changes in ourselves. And when Kisagotami had said goodbye to her son and come back to the Buddha, even though she was grieving a lot, she was still really grieving, that's when she was in that human state. And that's where she could actually start to make changes and start to understand the world. Okay, and this is where, you know, she really saw about impermanence. And I think from that she saw her connection with other beings. Because that's how she saw impermanence. Because as she went from household to household, she realised that she wasn't alone in terms of the suffering she was experiencing. That actually that was something that was happening in all those different households as well. Okay, so let's go back to the cause of suffering. Okay, so the cause of suffering traditionally is craving. And that can be kind of difficult, I think, to get your head around. Partly because there's something about craving things, wanting things. That's quite a good thing, isn't it? You know, wanting the world to be a good place, a better place, wanting things for people. And also, I like the idea of being interested in things, of relating to people. I don't want to be someone who's kind of really removed from life and kind of going around without any craving at all. I don't want to be completely calm and dispassionate and sort of let suffering continue for others. A kind of sense almost that you could kind of become a person where you no longer really cared. Now that's absolutely not what the Buddha's saying, okay? He's not saying at all, let's accept things how we are, let's become someone who's detached. The opposite, really. First of all, because the state that we get of horrified anxiety, which comes from seeing other people suffering, in my experience, when I get that, that's all about me, and it doesn't actually help me to help anybody else, because I'm really involved with the unpleasant feeling it's creating in myself. And I think for many professional help givers, this can be a real issue, that it's actually more about the person who's giving the care than it is about the person who's receiving the care. And you'll know that good carers don't do that. So if someone's looked after you and you've realised that they're looking out for you, they're actually, it's not about them at all, it's about you. And I think that's why, so that's what we're talking about in terms of developing, moving away from craving. It actually allows us to no longer be doing it, it's about ourselves. And the Buddha's also not saying, don't love your friends and family, don't, in fact the opposite. Because again, if it's all about us, and it's all about what can I get from somebody else, my own clingy, kind of neurotic needs to be fed by somebody else, well, I'm not actually loving them at all. What I'm loving about them is that they make me feel quite good. They kind of, in some ways do things that make me feel quite good. So actually, the more that we can be less driven by craving, the more helpful we can be to people. This is what I'm trying to get across, that it can seem like moving away from craving might make us kind of quite cold, and I'm saying it's the opposite. It'll actually allow us to be helpful in the world. It'll help us to be warmer and more useful to people. And it's not that we're trying not to desire something, okay? So it's not like you're kind of going around going, I don't want that cake, I don't want that cake, I don't want that cake, okay? Because that really works, isn't it? It's more that we're trying to transmute our desire into something that will actually make us happy in the long run. So it's a bit like we use that bit of us that wants to be happy, and we're looking for the long run, what will actually make us happy. And becoming more and more aware that if I'm not wanting one thing, well actually then I'm wanting another. So it's a bit like, I have the cake and I eat it, and then I want something else, and then I want something else, and then I want something else. And it's the wanting that's the problem, okay? It's not the things, they're fine, it's the wanting. And it's a bit like, if we set up our lives so we're always going from what we want to another thing that we want, it's a bit like we're drinking salty water when we're thirsty. We're just going to become more and more thirsty, like those poor old hungry ghosts. So the next one is there's a cessation of suffering. So it's not a cessation of craving, it's a cessation of suffering. So when we're free not to act on the prompts of the craving, when we've broken those addictive cycles, that leads us to greater freedom and autonomy, and it leads into creativity in our lives rather than reactivity. And I hope you'll have experienced, perhaps if you've ever been on retreat or when you've been meditating, that freedom that you can get. You're no longer just being driven by, I want this, I want that, but actually there's a kind of freedom that you're working in. You can see a craving arise, but you don't have to act on it. And we can't willfully discard suffering or craving. What we need to do is look at the conditions in our life and do what we can to remove the conditions that provoke it. And the root of that craving is that lasting, permanent happiness will be found in this world. So when we're dependent on our sense of identity on others, on people, and we depend on things that are impermanent, we're going to always feel anxious. Because we are subject to change, we're subject to suffering. So how can we hope to be free when we're always looking to those things outside us that change and give us suffering in the hope that somehow they're going to make us happy? It hasn't worked before, but it's going to work one day if I just keep trying hard enough. Okay. And logically, I'm sure you know this, because we've done it on, we don't talk about it all the time. But actually, I think the thing is it goes very, very deep into our sense of being a human being. Because if it didn't, I wouldn't be so shocked when somebody dies, okay? Which I am, obviously really shocked and upset when somebody dies. I'm really shaken by it. And it's, in a way, I still live as if things like sickness and death are betrayals, okay? That they're an outrageous deviation from this kind of smooth flow of life that shouldn't be like that. So I suppose my practice is to try and know more and more that impermanence is real, so that it no longer seems so outrageous when I'm hit by the fact that it really is. And then, of course, there is a path, and the path, I'm not going to go through it now because I've spoken for long enough, but people who've just come from the intermediate course will recognise the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is the path that we have, and it's a cumulative process. We have vision, we transform. Our vision changes, we transform it in all areas of our lives. And you can see it a little bit in Kisagotami. So she had this glimpse, this vision, that we really are impermanent. And because of that, she got emotion. She was really motivated. And part of her emotion actually was love for the Buddha, because she was very inspired by him. And then in her activities, she lived out the transformation. She meditated, she made effort, she tried to put it into action in her speech. And this kind of happens again and again for us, that we keep working with all these different areas. So, what happened to Kisagotami in the end? So, years later, she becomes fully enlightened. And just before that, she has a visit from a person called Mara, or a being called Mara. And if you haven't come across Mara, he's great. He's like an embodiment of what gets in the way of enlightenment, of what gets in the way of our own liberation, our own freedom. Whatever gets in the way, that's Mara. And in fact, Mara kept visiting the Buddha after his enlightenment. It's like Mara doesn't go away, he just keeps coming back. And Mara, so she's out in these wild forests on her own, and Mara says to her, having entered the woods all alone, are you on the lookout for a man? And she says, I see you, Mara. I see you, Mara. And that's what we can say to our own doubts and insecurities. She says, no, I'm not on the lookout for a man. I'm here in seeking liberation. I can see what you're trying to do. And as soon as you do that, Mara just goes and kind of disappears. And then she goes on to say, I have practiced the great eightfold way, straight to the undying. I have come to the great peace. I have looked into the mirror of the Dharma. The arrow is out. I have put my burden down. What had to be done has been done. I, Sister Kisagotami, with a free mind, have said this. So that's the story of Kisagotami, who through her own, through the Guru, the Tantric Guru of extreme suffering, in the end found peace and freedom through seeing impermanence. And I think it's great that she's left us her example, her story, 2,500 years later.